GIP medications. So glucagon-like peptide. A peptide is a chain of amino acids, and they're strung together and in smaller molecules that make up a hormone. So that's not really important. I guess the important thing to take away from that is that your body actually makes compounds like these GIP and GLP medications, and that's actually why they've literally changed the landscape when it comes to how we're managing patients who are maybe pre-diabetic or diabetic or having problems with weight loss. And so this is a peptide that your body makes, and that's why they're not only very well tolerated, they've been proven to be extremely safe, and the data is not just the blood sugar lowering benefits, but also it extends beyond that. And those are some of the topics that we're going to talk about today. So medications, you may hear the term Ozempic, but that structure is actually semaglutide. So the generic form is of, the trade name by the drug company, I believe that one's the Pfizer, is Ozempic or Wegovy. Ozempic is approved for diabetes treatment. Wegovy has been approved for treatment of obesity. And so it was the first of its kind, and that's why in 2021, we started hearing more information thanks to some, prominent media figures like Kim Kardashian, who all of a sudden lost a tremendous amount of weight, and it was suspected to be due to these medications. So tirzepatide is like a cousin of semaglutide. It's a newer medication. It has two different pathways and mechanisms of action, but it really is, you could think along the same lines. These are very similar medications, and they work in very similar ways. Like I mentioned before, they're approved for the treatment of type 2 diabetes, and they also have recently been approved for weight loss, okay? You may have seen some information in the media when it comes to these medications, everything from wonder drugs on one hand to, on the other hand, things like paralyzed intestines and all types of troubles. So again, I think just to we'll answer some of those questions, but the media's job, I think, is to sensationalize things many times. And so that definitely, we've seen a lot of that in the media. All right, so to get into these surprising benefits of GLP-1 and GLP medications. So interestingly, these drugs, I wasn't really, I'll kind of share a little bit about my background and my experience. The first time I ever was introduced to these medications was probably around 2008 when I was a student, and I was inside of a medical office, and there was a drug rep that was there that day. And his goal was to promote this new medication. He said, give this to your diabetic patients. They will love you. And I said, well, why? He said, well, they're going to lose weight, and they will love you, and they will stick to their medication because they are losing weight on it. And this was back in 2008, 2009 that I can recall. The first drug was approved in 2005, just so you understand how long we've been using these medications. They're not necessarily new, even though they're made to be maybe promoted that way in the media. So indeed, they were helpful, extremely helpful for weight loss. And in 2021, we saw that the FDA first approved semaglutide or Ozempic for use in weight loss. So as people began using the medications, what we've started to see is that it's not just weight loss, that there are some dramatic improvements and other reasons to be using GLP and GLP-1 medications. Of course, the glucose lowering benefits, which our blood sugar is thought to, elevated blood sugar is thought to largely drive the inflammatory process. And I know that you all have heard that term inflammaging, right, from your presenters before. But inflammaging, our body is a divine and wonderful system. No matter what your basis and foundation in that belief, our body intends to always heal itself through the inflammation process. However, though, that inflammation can be driven by things like sugar in our diet, stress in our lifestyle, lack of sleep, toxins in our environment. Many of these things are things that we can do little about and sometimes a lot about. And so when we see the glucose lowering benefits associated with these medications, it has a lot to do with the inflammatory process and how these drugs work. Some of that known and understood very well, and others, I'd say we were kind of on the forefront to really understanding why are these drugs having such a tremendous impact across so many systems. So interestingly, with the glucose lowering benefits, some of the wonderful effects have been weight loss. And so about 14.9% of weight loss has occurred due to these medications, which compared to a placebo group that didn't receive the medications, about 2.3%. So prior to the medications, I used to tell my patients, nutrition, lifestyle, and that does a great, I'm looking at Alana here, right? We can do a lot of that, and a lot of it is within our resources to do. However, some of it, I would say, we can go to the gym. For many people, they can go to the gym, they can exercise, and that weight loss is maybe just not as achievable as they would like. And so with this study group, this is over a 3-year study, the individuals lost on average 14.9%, again, compared to the placebo group. I did the math just so you kind of understood what that looked like. And for a 220-pound individual, now I'm wondering where I am on my notes. There it is, 33-pound weight loss. So this is like significant amount of weight that individuals are losing with these drugs. And also to discuss those glucose lowering benefits, have you been told to check your A1C, or your A1C, right? That's the 3-month average with our blood sugar. We should really be concerned about that. The goal is for it to be, in my opinion, 5.4 or below, far below the pre-diabetic range. But for the diabetic range, 5.7 to 6.4. 6.5 and above is technically diabetes, but these groups saw a 1.6% reduction in their blood sugar, which is monumental. If I've ever had a patient come back and been able to reduce their A1C, it is just, to that level, is a tremendous impact because of the inflammation that is associated with increased and elevated blood sugar. Interestingly, this is where I think that this MACE cardiovascular event reduction is where a lot of traditional healthcare providers, your kind of regular primary care, your endocrinologists have really bought into these drugs because of the impact that these medications have had when it comes to cardiovascular disease. Initially, there was research that was put out, was like, okay, is this safe for the heart? I think that they intended that they were going to find out that these drugs were actually not safe from a cardiovascular standpoint. But when it comes down to it, the blood sugar impact was truly what drove the benefits. And so you understand what this means. The incidence of cardiovascular disease is 3 times higher for people who have problems with their blood sugar than those who don't. So what it means is that our top priority should be from a longevity standpoint and from a health standpoint, should be controlling blood sugar, always. 2 tests. You're used to your doctor running that hemoglobin A1C and looking at a fasting glucose. Another elevated step that we like to do from a longevity perspective is make sure you know what your fasting insulin is. Make sure you know what your inflammatory markers are. These are easy tests, and they can be ordered. I mean, again, this is not like you have to go to a specialty lab. This can be done through SNORequest at your routine visit. So if your primary care doctor isn't on board, advocate for a functional medicine-minded provider who is willing to do these tests for you. Other additional benefits, and I think that the lower blood pressure actually comes from the weight loss that's associated with these medications. It can maybe be at the vascular level as well that blood pressure is lowered. But interestingly, improved cholesterol markers as well. So many benefits to these these drugs. Okay, who all has heard in the last 6 months that type 3 diabetes? Yeah. So, we used to think that Alzheimer's disease and our memory was like our genetics, right? We know that that's not the case. This also goes back to blood sugar. So when we start controlling the blood sugar in a more active way with these medications, we can see tremendous impacts from a neuro and cognitive perspective as well. And so we're saying may reduce the risk of neurodegenerative diseases. I would say arguably it does decrease the risk of neurodegenerative diseases. And the pathway, again, is blood sugar, insulin, and inflammation. Okay, that's how these medications are really having these tremendous impacts. If I could get my aging 76-year-old father-in-law to do one thing this guy is, he's a workhorse in the yard, just on the property doing so much for himself. But he has a bowl of ice cream every single day. And he's unfortunately, he's losing his cognitive abilities, and it's so sad. But man, I'm going to have to rip that ice cream out of his cold, dead hand because he's just not going to give it up. But again, blood sugar control. And for him, from a longevity standpoint, is, in my mind, controlling that. How could we do that? He won't give up the ice cream. Could we maybe give him some of these drugs to help improve blood sugar? Maybe some supplements to help improve blood sugar and make sure that he stays active in the yard and with it as much as possible? Absolutely. So again, mechanism is reduction of brain inflammation and oxidative stress. Many people have gone on to report mood improvement, cognitive function while on these medications. So a great story, because I love putting stories to the, to the delivery of this information because it's kind of hard to follow. It's a lot of medical terms. I had a patient who came to me. She was 42, has 3 kids, owns a business. She's a caterer, and she wanted to lose some weight. She's been going to the gym. She has a pretty active lifestyle. She's struggling, very much so. We put her on these medications. Her other history was she had ADHD. She had been diagnosed and had been medicated for ADHD since she was a teenager. So she had been on Adderall for like 23 years, right? Okay, so, but she had to focus. Like, she needed the medicine so she could focus, and she hated taking it. So she noticed after being on she was on semaglutide. She noticed after being on the semaglutide that she had gone like 2 weeks and hadn't had to take her Adderall. And so this woman achieved her weight loss, and she said, my goal in the beginning with these drugs was to take people off, right? Because when we first started these medications myself, I didn't have all of the research to say how helpful is it from a longevity perspective. So for her, she came, and I think she thought I was going to take away her medicine. And she said, I'm doing so well on these medications, and I haven't needed to fill my Adderall. Can I please stay on it? 100%. Absolutely. Would I rather give you a medication like semaglutide that has all of these benefits than a medication that's a controlled substance, right? People abuse Adderall. It increases and heightens our, stress response, our cortisol. Do people need it to, some people do need it. But ideally, we can use a peptide that's similar in shape and structure. Your body recognize it and look at all of the benefits. So she has successfully been off of those medications for about a year, and she's just doing wonderfully. She's also maintaining her weight and feels like she has more control over her diet as well. So it's really, really beautiful. Of course, these are the main reasons leading into this next slide here is appetite regulation and weight loss. I would say, or I wouldn't say, these are the number one reasons why my patients actually come to me and seek out these drugs is for appetite regulation and for weight loss. If you haven't heard the latest information and research on obesity and overweight, about 76% of our US population falls into the overweight and obese ranges. And it is one of the things that is driving our chronic disease, our healthcare costs, and of course, taking people's lives far sooner than they should. And so one of the benefits of the medications is it can have really great support as far as hunger and fullness goes. Most of our patients that are on it say they don't feel the need to snack in between meals, which is really wonderful because fasting is great for your health when done properly. And so they are craving less high-fat foods and sugary foods. And I would also say that, prior to these medications, when I was working in weight loss, it's really hard for patients to lose weight because we're saying, just muscle through it, just keep going. And when you don't have the energy and you're not necessarily seeing the scale change, it's really hard to stick with a routine, even if we know with all of the best intentions that we should be, doing the exercise and, eating the salad and doing all those things. So these medications have had a tremendous impact. And if people come to me for appetite and for weight loss, I'm actually happy because as a clinician, as a medical provider, guess what happens? Their blood pressure gets better, their cholesterol gets better, they start having the energy to pursue all of those health behaviors that we know that we need to do. And so it's just a beautiful thing. I would say it really has been a game changer because again, we're focused on nutrition and lifestyle and all of those health behaviors first, not just the medicine. Okay, so liver health. This is another unexpected benefit of semaglutide and these GLP medications. So the number one cause 2 decades ago for end-stage liver or liver disease was an infection called hepatitis C. It was because our baby boomer generation, there was higher rates of shared, whether it was from a tattoo needle or from IV drug use, sex. So liver, chronic liver failure was actually hepatitis C related. And so we only saw it in certain populations of people and we screened for it. But in the last 2 decades, that has far it's been far superseded by the development of fatty liver disease. Well, why do we get fatty liver disease? Processed food, high fat diets, and excess fat. And so the fat doesn't just accumulate in areas where we don't like to see it, like around the waist. It actually accumulates in our organs too, which is part of this whole inflammaging process. It can accumulate on our heart, on our liver, all throughout that visceral, we call that organ fat, visceral fat. And so one of the benefits to these medications has also been reduced liver fat concentration inside of the liver and improved liver function. So we're seeing that in patients as well, and it's fantastic. So definitely some long-term benefits from one of our vital organs. If we think about what the liver's process is, it's to detoxify. And so if we don't have adequate function of our liver, we are going to have other problems. One other really beautiful impact of these medications that we've recently learned has been our bone health. And so different mechanisms for, semaglutide or tirzepatide, but for many women, especially women, as we start to see that age-related hormonal decline and an increased prevalence of things like osteopenia and osteoporosis, that these medications can provide even an increased bone density or a kind of thwart off any further loss. So really, really wonderful. And of course, with that comes decreased risk for fractures. All right, so we've gone through like so many organs, brain, liver, right? Now we're up to in heart, and now we're to kidneys. So kidneys, again, are a filters all of our blood. Well, those kidneys, we know for patients who have elevated blood sugar, prediabetes and diabetes, one of the consequences is chronic kidney disease. Another really important marker to pay attention to that's oftentimes on every one of your panels is your eGFR. That is how well your kidneys are functioning. And I would say looking at that number and making sure wherever it may be, ideally it's above 80, optimal would be 90 to 100. But looking at that marker, and every year when you have your labs done, or if you're having those done quarterly, you should be looking at that marker so that you understand how have your kidneys aged from one marker to the next. Things like hydration, sugar in our diet, our blood pressure, very much impacts our kidney health. So with kidney protection, again, this comes from improved blood pressure, right? Because our kidneys are very sensitive to high blood pressure. So the GLP medications help to improve our blood pressure control, so less stress on the kidneys, and then again from the blood sugar impact on the vessels themselves. So improved kidney function. I have a patient who last week, I was looking at her markers, and she's 72. She's 72. And she's been on medications for weight loss. She's made a lot of healthy decisions and changed a lot of things. She's had a 20-pound weight loss in the last 10 months. And one of the benefits for her was that she actually had an 8-point increase from December of last year in her kidney function, which if we ask, again, traditional medicine, can we age in reverse? Say no, right? Because they don't see it often enough. But for this person, she definitely is showing signs of that reversal. And again, don't ever forget how powerful and incredible your body is. So kidney protection as well. So to kind of touch on again, kind of what we're seeing in clinical practice, I've mentioned some of those cases to you before or throughout the presentation today, but I would say the majority of people are coming because of their weight. And when we're finding things like diabetes or pre-diabetes, these are great medications. As a matter of fact, even the American Diabetic Association is now recommending that our first-line medication is metformin. You're probably familiar with that medicine. We used to then use other glucose-lowering medications orally, like glipizide, and then on to things like insulin. But we are now no longer recommending that because these drugs just have such a tremendous benefit and really, not any of the associated health risks when used properly. So they can be great. So again, weight loss for people who struggle with diet and exercise alone. I will never tell anyone that they can just use these drugs as a substitute for nutrition and lifestyle change. I think that when I see people lose the most amount of weight and have the greatest sustained results, it is because they have used these medications as a tool in their toolkit. They've met with professionals that can support them from a nutrition perspective. They've talked about their impact of their health from like a sleep and stress position. They are optimized from a nutrient perspective, whether that's the food that they're eating or the supplements that they're taking. And they're having, again, they're blowing all of the other people out of the water when it comes to how they're using the medications. It's also the pride that people feel, right? It's really hard to make nutrition and lifestyle changes, and many people or most people have struggled and probably failed at nearly every diet or sustaining weight loss for long periods of time. And so it's really great when you have a person who suddenly has results and is like, I can do it. I can stick to that gym routine. I can stick to the nutrition routine. And they feel really empowered by feeling better, right? So when we're eating better, we're moving better, we're sleeping better, we're feeling better, and we can sustain those changes over time. And again, it has been tremendous. I wanted to share with you when we first started that I was really kind of resistant to starting these medications 2.5 years ago. I really felt like patients could do it without any support. And when I saw these medications previously prescribed, it was for diabetes and for prediabetes. And so I had a woman who had really struggled. She's in her late 40s, early 50s now, and had tried all the things, had bariatric surgery and had regained weight. That happens all of the time, unfortunately. And she practically begged me. She said, please give me these medications. And I said, all right. After a couple of no's, I finally said, yes, I'll do it. And only if you're willing to work with a nutritionist and with a trainer. And she agreed. So we put her on these medications, and she completely changed my mind. And as we've learned more and more about these medications, it has changed my thought on the drugs. And so I don't think there's any reason to fear these drugs. I think there's a lot of reason to fear a lot of medications, but not these medications, because they just have shown to be safe over time. And so again, seeing her change and seeing her energy increase and seeing all the other positive benefits and how she finally was able to take control and lose weight was truly a wonderful thing, and she's still doing great. So we talked a bit about obesity. The one takeaway that I really want you to understand and take away today is truly about the blood sugar and how one of the top things, if you aren't already doing it, if you haven't heard this from your other speakers, which I think that you have, is around processed sugar and processed foods, processed grains. They're horrible for our health. They're creating a lot of damage. And so again, we can remove those from our diet, but when it doesn't seem to be enough, having a conversation with a healthcare provider that you trust about these medications and whether or not they can work for you. To touch on who they're not for, as well as we wrap up, there's really only one indication where we don't give these medications, and it is for patients who have a family history of thyroid cancer. And so the only reason why that is we've seen in mice studies that it could increase the risk of thyroid carcinoma. And so we've just not done that in human studies. However, all of our human studies do not show any increased incidence or any increased risk in thyroid cancer. So that's really important to know. Type 1 diabetes, it's not approved for yet because, again, we're really concerned about blood sugar, and they have less stable blood sugar because they don't have an active pancreas. And so while I think we're going to see that change for that group of people, it's technically frowned upon as far as the clinical application and use, just because, again, we would never want to do any damage. So again, beyond diabetes and just obesity, there's many cardiovascular, neuroprotective, appetite, bone, liver, and kidney benefits. Like, that's a lot of benefits from one little medication. I think we're going to see a lot more from the peptide, continue to be developed in mainstream media when it comes to peptides, in large part probably because of these medications. And I think there's a huge future and huge potential for GLP and GIP medications as far as expanding the overall benefit from a longevity perspective. The last thing I'll add, and I'm sure, Alana and I've talked a lot about microdosing these medications. It's really tough from a clinical standpoint because there's not a lot of data around microdosing. However, we're seeing tremendous impacts and benefits. The majority of my patients actually don't have these medications covered by their insurance, and so instead are using a compounded version. And we're having to use far less to achieve the same result as traditional medicine is using with the, trade drugs and kind of maxing out, the dosage. So it'll be really interesting to see kind of what the threshold is, but we're finding that we really don't have to, on most patients, go to the maximum dosage. And I would say that if you are getting these medications from your traditional doctor, you may not need to go up. So if you get these from your traditional doctor and you go through kind of a two-step process and you're losing weight, about 0.5 pound to 1.5 pounds per week, and you're feeling good, you don't have any need to go up. No need to go up. So keep those medications and the dosage low from my perspective and a functional medicine perspective, and work towards that weight loss and health goal. All right. Thank you all. Appreciate it.